Hi, I'm Peggy Farron. Thanks for joining us on the Understand Photography Show, where we talk about travel, nature, and fine art photography. We're going to be talking to repeat guest David Long about landscape composition. I know that sounds a little boring, but believe me, he's got some good things to say that maybe you haven't heard before. Now, remember, after the show, or actually anytime, go to our website to see show notes and see the pictures that we talk about. It's www.understandphotography.com. Now, when you get to our website, it's going to say, click here for freebies. Go ahead and click and choose something. We've got all kinds of different downloads and videos and things like that. In exchange, we do ask for your email address, and we will put you on the mailing list. We send out one email newsletter a month. That's it. And it's got photo tips and our schedule and different things in that you might be interested. And of course, you can always unsubscribe if you don't like it. Also, the 4 weeks to proficiency in photography is our signature course. It is a beginner to intermediate course. Now, it is a beginner course, but what I found is a lot of intermediate photographers have big gaps in their education. So this is a foundational class, and it's going to fill in those gaps. The first class is about exposure and shooting in the manual mode. And the second class is about composition, really good for today's class. Third class is lighting, including flash. Now, how to balance your flash so that it looks natural or against a backlight or whatever. And then the fourth class is what I call the techie stuff. Drive modes, metering modes, focus modes, different things like that. Our motto at Understand Photography is we simplify the technical. So we work hard to keep things really easy to understand. With all of our online classes and our hands-on classes and our tours, we break things down step by step so that nobody feels like something is over their head. If it is over their head, we're going to break it down more and more and more until you understand it. So David Long has been on the show before. He was on episode 138 talking about his guidebooks. He has several guidebooks that he's published, and he just published a new book on composition. So today we're going to talk about composition in landscape photography, because sometimes it's really hard to figure out how to make your landscape look really good. David lives in New England and does workshops, photo workshops, both in New England and in St. Augustine. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Great to be back.
I was going to say welcome back would be a better thing to say. Now, in case people did not hear your last episode, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, no, I'm primarily a landscape photographer, and I live in New England, where I conduct workshops and write ebooks about primarily New England, but I spend about 10 weeks down in Florida every year, down in St. Augustine, Florida, just to get out of the winter in February through April. And I've been doing landscape photography professionally for about 5 years, very actively for about the last 10. And I do a lot of traveling around the world. So I usually take 3 or 4 trips to some destination around someplace in the world. Last year it was Peru and Iceland. And this year I've got Japan and Greece on my schedule. So I do a lot of domestic shooting. I lead workshops, like I said, in New England, and then I get out and do my own traveling, sometimes with workshops, sometimes on my own, to other parts of the world to see interesting landscapes.
Wow. You are doing a great job out there. I know for me, for us, the off season is the summer. And so I try to travel when I can in the summers.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So today we're going to talk about composition in landscape. And it sounds like a boring topic. So we have to work hard to make it interesting, okay?
Absolutely. It's the guts of landscape photography.
It really is. And one of the things I say all the time is, our 4 weeks to proficiency in photography class, we teach the technical side of photography as far as exposure, how to shoot a manual, metering modes, drive modes, that kind of stuff. And there is a composition class in the middle of that. And people are like, oh, I have a good eye. No, this is an important class, because when you look at photography competitions, you know, I'm a judge for a lot of competitions. Nobody turns in under or overexposed pictures. They're exposed properly, but they're not winning, or they're not, it's a composition problem if they're not. So what would be the first thing to think about, I guess, when you're doing a landscape photograph? What do you think about?
Well, what I teach my students is you have to have a focal point, is the #1 priority for me. A landscape photograph without a focal point is like, you know, going to a stage play and just seeing a blank stage and no actors on it. You really don't know where to look. The eye is always searching for something in an image. I mean, if you're going out and, you know, doing your own touring, and you stop at the overlooks and you stop at the beautiful vistas, you know, that's totally different than when you're shooting it with a camera. And as a result, the viewer of your image, if he just looks at a big blank vista, his eye, you know, subconsciously is searching around saying, what am I supposed to be looking at? And usually, you know, if that's the photograph, if you've entered in a competition, the judge looks at it, he doesn't know what to look at, and he says, yeah, it's a pretty color, or it's a pretty scene, or whatever, but he doesn't spend any time with it, because he doesn't know where to look, and thus he doesn't know what the perspective is, he doesn't see any story in the photograph, and it's just a pretty scene. You know, I get non-photographers all the time that say, what a beautiful sunset out there. And I go, yeah, it was, but I didn't go out and shoot it because I didn't have any composition, you know, that I thought was worthwhile of having the sunset accent or improve the composition. So for me, it's all about finding compositions and then working that particular image so that I take the viewer into that composition through different techniques.
Okay, so let's talk about, give me some examples of focal points / subjects.
Sure. I mean, if you're going to go out, and whether it be a nature scene, you know, that has an animal in it, or it could be a nature scene with a mountain or a waterfall, or, you know, anything that the eye is going to go to, and where you want the viewer's eye to go to is the example of a focal point. Sometimes it can be a singular focal point, you know, a gorgeous waterfall, or sometimes it can be multiple focal points, multiple actors on the stage, where in many cases you are trying to then arrange those focal points so that they tell a story and kind of lead the viewer's eye to what you want to be the main focal point.
Okay, I'm going to give an example because I just, you know, we do tours in the backcountry of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. In fact, the only way you can get back there is through Understand Photography.
Okay.
And so I just did one, and we get to our sunset spot, and the people are like, well, it's not the greatest sunset, and it's just, there's just like kind of vastness with a lot of cypress trees, not super close, but like just all over the place. And so I say, look for groupings of 3s or 5s, look for odd numbers, you know, place it off to the rule of thirds grid line, something like that. Because if you just took that picture without a pretty sunset, it would be super boring.
Yes.
But if you can position yourself, because sometimes if you're standing looking and you don't see a group of 3 cypress trees, let's say, but if you move 3 steps to the left, all of a sudden you'll see that grouping. Right. They're there, it's just that they're not close enough together, or they're too close together. If you move, you can get something like that. but it is hard. Or else I tell them get down low so you can have the water in the foreground, but nobody ever wants to climb down there with the alligators and snakes. I did.
Yeah,
I did it the other day because this time I wore my boots. I always forget to wear my boots, but I wore my boots.
right.
So, but nobody would go down there because it is a little scary.
Oh, it can be, absolutely. And
But I mean, that was
but
just
you're
the
right,
example.
you're on the right track. Is in many cases then, my next piece of advice for that student might be, okay, change your lens around so that you take that grouping of cypress trees and you zoom in on it so that in many cases it becomes more important in the image than if you were using a 16 millimeter and it was way off in the distance and just a little dot that the viewer would never recognize. So
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm constantly, I mean, the human eye for the most part sees at around 50 to 60 millimeters. And so anything I can do to either go wider, 16 to 24, or more telephoto, usually 80 to 200. I would say the vast majority of my best shots are either very super wide or telephoto. So if I was in a sunset location, and I didn't, like last night I was shooting sunsets in St. Augustine. And I was very frustrated because of the fact that the sunset's right over the city, but there's no logical viewpoint for that. And so I finally worked around and found a place to shoot, but I was so far away from the water that, I ended up shooting it with a 150 millimeters to capture the city with the sunset behind it. And then I moved
Ah.
over to another point right below the Bridge of Lions, and I shot that with 16 millimeters because I now had a wonderful focal point with the bridge leading into the city and the beautiful towers of St. Augustine in that. And so in many cases, I shot two images of exactly the same sunset, one at 150 millimeters, one at 16 millimeters, because I had different focal points and different interests. And, I posted one today on Instagram, which I usually post every day on Instagram. And people love the 16 millimeter because of the fact that it's a whole different perspective on the bridge. Because I was literally right under the bridge on the seawall looking into the city, and they don't see that perspective. They don't see that image. They're up, back on the sidewalk. They're looking at it with their 50 millimeter eyes. They're not looking at it super wide, changing the perspective of the bridge and creating different focal points, or keep changing the view of focal points that they're very familiar with, but seeing it in a different way.
Okay, so you said a few different things there. One was about the different different lenses,
Yes.
lengths of your lens, but it sounded to me like you just said you were in a different vantage point too than most people. Like most people will stand at the end of the bridge and get the lion in front and get the cityscape way in the back.
Yes.
But you said you went underneath?
Well, I was on the other side of the bridge, looking across the river, the Matanzas River, and as a result, I was before you go into the city. I was, on the other side of the city. So I
So
was
you changed.
so there's a couple hotels over there that you can kind of work around their particular property and get right down on the seawall so that you're literally right under the bridge.
Okay, that's interesting. So change your vantage point so that it's not the normal vantage point as well.
Oh, absolutely. And most people, they're 5 to 6 feet tall. And so most people see, and if they set up a tripod, it's usually 5 to 6 feet, tall. And so, the common thing that I always tell people when I'm judging or doing workshops is the judge is going to look at that image and say, I've seen that image 100 times. I mean, there's not a lot of unique images anymore with everybody having a camera, but there are unique perspectives on images that people are familiar with. And if you can change the perspective either by changing your position, like you talked about, getting down in the swamp. Most people don't want to get in the swamp. So once you did, you changed something that they don't usually see, or changing the lens so that it either exaggerates something in the foreground, like a wide angle lens would, or it compresses the image like a telephoto does. It shows them something that they're very familiar with, the skyline of St. Augustine and the Bridge of Lions, but it shows them in a way that, one, they haven't been to that location, and two, they see it, because of the lens, they see it in a way that their eye doesn't normally see something like that.
Okay. So now, are you a person who believes in always putting your subject on the rule of thirds grid line, or what do you think of that idea?
It's a good starting point. It's a good, but because that's so common, that again, it's something that the judge or the viewer views as commonplace, and thus he doesn't spend any time with it. I'm really trying to get my audience to look at my image, look at it again, by changing the perspective, changing the angle, changing where I put my focal point. And in many cases, you can use the golden ratio, you can use the spiral technique, you can use the rule of thirds. There's a lot of compositional techniques out there that are popular. But sometimes if you break it, what I say, if I break the rule, I want to break it elegantly, so that people know that I broke the rule, but it's still visually pleasing.
Right. That's what I always say. I always say you should know the rules before you break them, because
Exactly.
then you can justify, and usually you can justify it just by the picture. You don't have to talk about it.
Right.
But
and a lot of that is, I use symmetry a lot, because I do, in landscapes, I do a lot of water photos. So I do a lot of reflections.
okay.
And in those cases, the eye is looking for symmetry. The eye, anytime you see something that's a mirror image, the eye wants to see, the mirror. It wants to see, it knows, okay, you're on a lake, you're on a river, you're on a pond, you're on a whatever it happens to be. I've got that little puddle of water, down below the lighthouse. Wow, I just want to see that small fraction of the lighthouse mirror imaged in that little pond of water. But you've got to get down there, and that could be a compositional technique then that I look at that doesn't fall in with any of those normal techniques, because I may be, in fact, bringing that reflection in a totally different part of the image, and that's what I want the eye to go to first before it goes in and sees the rest of the scene.
All right. So what if we get to a scene that looks cluttered? Like, for instance, the cypress trees.
Mm-hmm.
It just looks like a bunch of cypress trees. Pretty boring.
Yep.
Or a cityscape.
Yep.
So much clutter.
Yep. And we have the same thing in New England. New England has a lot of trees, but it has a lot of brush, and so I constantly am working to declutter my photos. And
give us some tips for decluttering and simplifying our photo and separating. I'm a big fanatic about separation. Separation's my thing.
Yep. Well, one is get closer. So if your scene is too cluttered, then try getting closer to the scene so that you remove some of the clutter.
And you can get closer by your feet or with a long lens.
Yeah, exactly. I tend to try first with my feet, because I like to bring the viewer into my photo. I mean, if I say one thing to my workshop attendees above anything else, I go, get closer to the scene, because I'll line people up, I'll take them someplace and they'll be standing 10 feet away from the water or the river or the beach or whatever. And I'm going, is there some type of barbed wire here that's keeping you from walking up to the edge of the water. You want to, I don't want my viewer to look at the scene. I want them to feel like they're in the scene.
Ah.
And as a result, I'll get closer and then I'll use a wider lens. And then I'll particularly pay attention to foreground elements so that they immediately feel like they're in that, they're in that forest, or they're in that garden, or they're in that field of flowers or whatever. So that's one way I declutter, is to, really get closer to the scene and kind of keep bringing it down to a more simplistic point. And then, the other thing I do is I tell my students is, don't get married to a scene. I mean, how many times have I take people out, they set up their tripod and they sit there for a half hour and take exactly the same picture with 30 minutes of different lights or different lighting. And so I tell people, I want you to come back with 10 to 15 different compositions of this same scene and the same focal point. Different perspective, different lenses, different angles, because invariably, if you walk up, what you do is you probably have seen that scene before. And you tend to go to the scene that's in your mind. And that scene isn't unique. And so I ask them to keep, take that classic photo, but then keep moving around to try to get your own spin on it. And as you move around, pay a lot of attention to the edges of your photograph. So people tend to get fixated on their focal point. And as a result, they don't look around the edges of their image. And as a result, they don't declutter in camera. You can do a lot of decluttering and simplification of the scene just by changing around and being observant of stuff that's impacting the edges of your photograph. Lights, bright, something that's bright, branches that are cut off in the wrong place. Worst case scenario, people's limbs that are cut off, at joints, whatever it happens to be, because they were so fixated on the lighthouse or the waterfall or the mountain that they forgot to look that they just cut, the whole field of flowers. That was a beautiful foreground element. They totally cut that off in the wrong place. And so I look at them and say, get your angle, work with different compositional techniques, but then always be looking for decluttering the scene, simplifying the scene, and also be looking for visual flows.
And what do you mean by that?
Leading lines.
Okay.
Light.
Give us some examples.
Oh, any, fences in New England. We have wonderful fence posts or tree lines, or, streams that lead into a waterfall, different visual flow techniques that take the viewer's eyes and lead them to the main focal point. So kind of decluttering, if you're looking at the edges of your photograph, you're also going to notice, do you have lines that are leading you to your main subject, or do you have lines that are leading you away from and out of the picture?
Or it's stopping you from coming into the picture, because I see that a lot of times. People will have like a horizontal line right in the beginning of the picture, and that's like, stop, don't come in.
Exactly. And by getting closer and changing your perspective, especially getting low, you invite them into the picture.
I like
it. And if you invite them into the picture, they then become very intrigued with that picture and want to spend more time with it. Whether it be somebody who wants to buy your photo, somebody who wants to judge your photo, or just your casual audience on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. They're seeing that scene and it's inviting to them. And so much of this, Peggy, is subconscious. you know, you ask somebody, do you like a shot? Do you not like a shot? And they can tell you they really like it or they don't like it as much, but a lot of times they can't tell you why.
I know.
And so trying to figure out what they don't like about the photograph and then correcting that in your composition. And that's why I'm such a big fan of composition is it's finding out, you know, what your key subject is, what your main focal point is, and then try to bring your audience into the photo. And once they're into the photo, trying to bring them in through all kinds of lighting techniques, through visual flow techniques, the way you position the focal point, you know, in terms of, you know, the rule of thirds or the symmetry example that I gave you, you know, trying to do all those, but also understanding that, at least for me, I'm much better at doing my composition on a computer than I am through the viewfinder.
What do you mean by that?
I'll take a shot. I can't tell you how often that I've gone in and said, I love this particular composition. This is absolutely my favorite. I know this is going to be my favorite of the group. And then I'll shoot that particular scene from 10 or 15 different compositions. And I get home, and once I start working on all the images that I took at that scene, I would say more often than not, another composition, another photograph from that particular scene becomes my favorite, where on the scene itself, I wouldn't have thought that. It's usually, I usually in many cases think the one that I'm happiest with through the viewfinder is going to be my favorite. And I would say it equals out that I find some other composition and some other way to adjust that particular image in post-processing that another one becomes my favorite, just because I had a variety to pick from.
And are you talking about, I understand you have a variety to pick from, but also are you talking about cropping it in Photoshop or whatever to get a different composition? Is that what you mean?
Could be. You know, generally speaking, I don't like to crop a lot because I'm, unless I'm doing a moonrise or something like that, where I need, to really zero in and use a small piece of the photograph. Again, my rule of thumb is I always tell people, frame in the camera and then back off 20%.
Oh, okay.
Because of the fact that more often than not, I've been burned by the fact that, when I straightened it or when I straightened some of the things in it, I lost something in the photograph that was important to me, a leading line, some other compositional element that I wished I would have had back. So I kind of do my framing in, and then I back off 20%. So I've got a little bit of room around for doing post-processing techniques.
Okay, that's good advice.
But I rarely go in and, just take out a small element of an image, because it gets too noisy and too grainy, and, it in many cases doesn't meet my quality standards, for a really good photograph.
Okay, so you just crop a little bit. Okay. So what are some other composition rules that we should learn about? So we know, everybody thinks they know about the rule of thirds. I don't know that people really do. I think everyone understands that the landscape, not the landscape, what am I trying to say? The horizon should be either on the bottom grid line or the top grid line. But that's a rule that we all break on a regular basis and put it right smack dab in the middle, because it depends on what else is in the picture. What other composition rules do you think are important for people to learn about?
Well, the horizon one is an important one, and I always tell people, make a judgment. What's more important in your image? So let's say you're taking a picture of a lighthouse, which we do a lot in New England. Is the foreground or the sky more important? And give your weighting, give your 2/3 or more to the part of the photograph that's more interesting to the viewer. And the other small thing in that is make sure your focal point breaks the horizon. So there's nothing.
What do you mean?
You don't want like a top of a church or something, the top of a dune shack or something like that. You don't want that to line up exactly with the horizon, even though you may have positioned the horizon 2/3, down or 2/3 up. You don't want the top of that dune shack to line up right with that horizon of where you've basically put that particular image.
Yeah, that makes sense, because if you did have like a roof line along with the horizon, that line would just sort of blend together, so it wouldn't look as good.
Exactly.
Okay.
Again, that's
I
a
get it.
subconscious thing where somebody looks at it and can't figure out what they don't like about the image, but that turns out, to be something important, and it gives more prominence to your focal point.
Okay.
So those are some compositional rules, that I always follow is simple things like that, of where you place the horizon, and then I'm really working on, how I want that particular image to be positioned with the other elements in the scene. So I really try to create a lot of depth in my photographs.
Okay.
And so so I don't want my photograph to look flat. So I don't want it to be, a dune shack on a beach or a lighthouse on a, rocky point, and just have you look at that. I want you to be looking at the foreground. I want you to be looking at in between the foreground and the midground. I want you to be looking at the midground. I want you to be looking at the background. In some cases, I'm really trying to get 5, 6, 7 layers of interesting things.
So when you say that, what do you mean? Like having maybe rocks in the foreground before the shack?
Could be.
And then have
could be the leading line of the grass. It could be flowers. It could be dune grass. In between, it could be, there could be something interesting in the background. It could be, a dune that's just behind the dune shack, and on the horizon, I might have a beautiful sky. So in many cases, I'm really trying to bring my viewer into that image. So if I've created an inviting pathway into my image, and then I've given them many things to look at throughout the image. So you just entered my image of the lupin field in front of the church with the beautiful sunset behind it. Okay, you immediately you see the church up on the hillside. That's in the midground where usually most of my point of interest are. But you enter it by seeing this beautiful flow of lupins going up the hill, and then you see the church, and then behind the church you see a beautiful stand of trees, birch trees behind it, and behind that you see a beautiful sunset. So I've got 5 layers of interesting things for the viewer to see,
if you can.
If I can.
Right.
Yeah. And those are all important elements.
But sometimes there just isn't that much interest, right?
Exactly. And those can be powerful images too. So there's a real use by some photographers of negative space.
Okay.
And so they'll just have, I don't know if you've ever seen what we would call minimalist photography. I follow some photographers that do, I've never been there, but they do photography of winter scenes in northern Japan. During the winter, it's just white with just little bits of grass coming out, or little, just small features. And they're a small tree sitting, 2 small trees sitting on a hillside, nothing else there. Absolutely gorgeous. He's not going to have a foreground. He's got 2 closely positioned trees in the midground, and he's got nothing in the background, and he's got this huge amount of negative space. So it's not a close-up of those trees. it's an extended view of those trees so that you can look at nothing. And as a result of looking at nothing, looking at all this negative space, your eye automatically comes back to those two trees.
Now
And,
that's interesting you say two, because
or I'm just, for
odd
example,
numbers are what we
yeah,
really
yeah,
like.
yeah. And odd
And
numbers,
sometimes
rule of
if I have two and not three, I will try to change my position so it looks kind of like one. Did that
yes,
make sense? So it's
yeah,
clumped together.
or give prominence to one.
One or the other,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
And I
if
would
I don't,
imagine with the snow scene like that, not that I will ever take one because I like to be warm,
well, yours
but
might be sand. Yours might be sand.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I would imagine you would use the lines and the light to lead your viewer around in a case like that where you just have, because it wouldn't just be a bunch of white with a tree. That would be boring, right?
No, it's absolutely breathtaking if done correctly.
With no shadows, no lights, you're just
Usually,
plain.
usually done, on snowy days. I mean, some of my favorite images in New England are shot during snowstorms,
Okay.
where I've got a red covered bridge, totally surrounded by snow covered trees and a white bed of snow going across a river. And there's nothing to look at in that image except this brilliant white covered bridge framed by all these beautiful snow covered trees.
Now, I would imagine from what you just said to me in the beginning of this talk, that you would take that bridge and you would make it a small part of the picture, maybe on a PowerPoint up in the top right quadrant, and then you would fill the frame with the bridge, and then you would, I don't know, center the bridge maybe? Is that what you do when you try to do that type of thing?
That's where taking a lot of images, there's no rule, I can't give a rule of thumb on that. It comes from taking thousands of images. And in some cases, I'll play around with that image and I'll shoot that, like I said, I'll shoot that scene wide, I'll shoot it telephoto, I'll shoot it up close, I'll shoot it from a distance. And when I get home, I'll look at it and I'll say, what really works for my eye?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, it comes from experience. And sometimes I'll like multiple views of the same scene. So I'll get up close and the covered bridge will fill the scene. But see, on that particular example that I just gave, to me, the exciting thing about that was the snowstorm.
Okay.
So I want to give the viewer the feel of being out in a snowstorm, but also give them the beauty of the red bridge coming through this brilliantly blank white landscape. But little pieces where you can see, tree branches draped down, where you can see little pieces of the river are just enough that they know where they are. But they, in their memory banks, they go back and say, wow, I remember being in a snowstorm like that, how beautiful it was. And now they've added to that this beautiful red covered bridge that just kind of pops right out of the scene. But he's the only actor, the bridge is the only actor on the stage at that point.
Okay.
And I don't have to, like that example of the trees in Japan. You don't have to, in many cases, do a heck of a lot with light because that's what drew you there in the first place. The minimalist scene, the minimalist light that you had in that scene is what drew you to it and why you wanted to photograph it. And as a result, if you can interpret that correctly in your photograph compositionally, it's a totally different type of landscape photography. but one
All right,
that's
so
really stripped down.
so if you were doing a minimalist photo like that, how much of the photograph would be the subject, like the bridge? Would it be just a little, like like a, like a, not even a quarter, an eighth of the page?
No,
Just a tiny little bridge?
generally speaking, I'm going to give my focal point some, probably a third, a quarter to a third
Okay.
prominence.
Because the way I'm thinking is if it's a minimalist picture, you're going to have a lot of negative space. So it would be more negative space than the subject.
Right.
So you're saying 2/3 negative, 1/3 subject.
Yeah.
About. I mean, it could be different on any picture, but
yeah. If it's so small, Peggy, the viewer isn't going to be interested. And if it's so big that they can't get the feeling of the scene, if the bridge was 80% of the scene, they wouldn't really understand the beauty of the snow-covered terrain.
right.
But if the image was 5% of the scene, they'd be looking at a big white blank canvas with some, teeny red dot in the corner that wouldn't interest them at all. So that's why I kind of shoot it from, a lot of different angles and a lot of different compositions, and then I try to choose it. But to answer your question, I'd say somewhere between a quarter to a third is usually what a focal point would occupy in a minimalist scene like that.
Okay, so how can we use light as a compositional element?
Well, one of the simplest things that I recommend to students is the use of vignetting. And vignetting is a very simple way. You can do too much of it, but lightly vignetting, you'll see most landscape photographers will lightly vignette their scenes so that the eye subconsciously goes to the middle of it. But I'm a huge fan of light, but I'm also I also tell people light isn't the only thing in the photograph. So I mean, if you go to see a stage play, and you have your main actor, well, the spotlight isn't sitting on that person the whole time following them around the scene. They're doing some type of lighting that's subconsciously drawing you in to that main focal point. So what I try to do with my light is, obviously I like to shoot, at really pleasing times of the day. If it's, during the magic hour or even before the magic hour, I'll do a lot of shooting in the blue hour. So in that case, I like my light to be soft and to be very pleasing. And, the hardest thing with light is when you get into very tough shadows, midday type of light. So I do a lot of shooting light-wise on overcast days. As a landscape photographer, I'm doing waterfall shooting, I'm doing foliage shooting, I'm doing beach shooting. I love to go out and find a great sunset, sunrise, whatever, but they don't happen every day.
Right.
But I may want to go out and photograph every day. So I'm really looking for soft light, and I'm looking for overcast, high overcast. I'm looking for some type of weather. I'm looking for clouds. I'm looking for fog. I'm looking for something, that's going to give me some interesting light. And probably the least interesting light that you can get is, blue sky, sunny days with no clouds.
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes you get those, well, you need the clouds, of course.
Yeah.
But you get those God rays. Those are leading lines, right?
Yes.
I don't know what the official word for those.
No, but you generally speaking, don't get those in the middle of the day.
No,
you usually get those in the magic hour.
And you need clouds.
Yes, yeah.
So, yeah.
So I use a lot of apps. I'm a huge user of different apps. There's one called Clear Skies, which is a favorite app of mine that
Okay.
shows you the cloud cover forecast, and it gives you the cloud cover forecast in high clouds, medium clouds, and low clouds.
Oh, wow.
So it's a wonderful tool. If you're going to go out and shoot sunsets and you got a forecast that might be 60% clouds, but it's all low clouds, you're not going to get a sunset. If it's all high clouds, or if it's a mixture of high clouds and medium clouds, you have a much better chance. So I will use apps to, kind of guide me through whether it's going to be a good day for shooting during the magic hour.
Wow. You are high tech.
Yeah. Oh, well, the apps are great that I use, sunset apps, weather apps, cloud cover apps, I use, but they can also be paralyzing because of the fact that you tend to rely on them too much. I mean, just the other day, I looked at an app for sunsets, and it said there was, very minimal chance of a sunset that evening. So I went and took a gym class in yoga, and in the middle of the yoga class, I looked out the window, and this ungodly sunset was happening, and I said, "All right, you just got to go out." Yeah, if it's going to be, if it's a rainy day and it's thunderstorming and something like that, and it's not going to give you great light, that's one thing. But if there's clouds in the sky, generally speaking, I'm going to be out there because there's always a chance that, something will break on the horizon and you get, tremendous light coming in, in one of those prime periods.
Yeah, okay. And it's kind of what you said earlier. Just keep, you were talking about composition, change your composition, change your lens, but also just being out there under all different kinds of lighting. Sometimes you get something good.
Oh yeah, yeah, and wait for it. I mean, that's the other thing I tell my students is most of your good light's going to come after the sun goes down or before the sun comes up. I mean, I shot a beautiful sunset last night right over the city, as I mentioned, of St. Augustine, and the sun was on its way down just at sunset. The scene was almost unshootable. There was so much color in the sky. And about 15 minutes after the sunset was the image that I got that provided the best light on the scene. Where right at sunset, it was too bright and there was just too much color in the sky.
Yeah, you just never know. Sometimes the light is harsh up until 2 minutes before the sun goes down.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's pretty an hour before the sun goes down. You just don't know. So,
yeah.
And then sometimes the afterglow is the best on sunsets. So.
Well, it also when you get in the afterglow, the dynamic range of the scene dramatically changes. So if you're working with a very bright sunrise or a very bright sunset, you tend to really struggle with silhouettes and a huge difference between your focal point and your and the sky. And so the more I get into the 15, 20, 30 minutes after sunset, I'm now getting far less dynamic range difference between the sky and my focal point.
So in other words, you can see your focal point.
I can see my focal point and my audience can see my focal point. Not that silhouette shots are bad by any means, but in many cases, I'm trying to show the viewer, the focal point, the key thing in my photograph. And if the sunset or sunrise is so dominant that they can't even see my focal point, then in many cases, the image isn't successful.
All right. So, give us 5 of your best tips for landscape compositions.
Oh gosh, I would say clearly change your perspective. So that's to me vital. that you get down on the ground, you get up above the subject, you show the landscape from a perspective that the viewer doesn't normally see it. Another one would be go wide or go telephoto.
I like that.
So in many cases, shoot it between 16 millimeter and 24 millimeter, or shoot it at 80 millimeters and above.
Okay.
Probably the most important that we've talked a lot about is have a focal point. So have something that your audience is interested in. If there's nothing interesting in your image, no matter how beautiful the sunset is, no matter how beautiful the forest is, they are going to look at it and they're going to pass on. Pay very close attention to the edges of your image so that you've got distracting things on the corners of your image, or you've got light, or you've got some other visual flow that's taking your viewer out of the scene.
Okay.
And the last point is keep shooting different shots of the same scene. So keep moving around. Don't get married to an image. Find an image, shoot it, move around, get totally different perspectives on the image. Because in many cases, what you're trying to achieve is a view of the scene that people may not have seen before. So as we talked about, subconsciously, you're going someplace, Portland Head Lighthouse, for example. You're going there because you've seen some drop dead gorgeous images of that lighthouse. But now your real thing that you're trying to focus on is, how do I show that scene differently than I remember it, or I saw it, or what drew me there, and how do I then put it out there so that my audience knows where I am, but they see it in a totally different way than they've seen it before. If you can do that, and my last one is try to achieve a story in your photograph. So we haven't talked a lot about the fact of to me, the lighting, the focal point, the perspective, all of those things are important. What really are my most successful images are ones that there's a story, and the viewer looks at it, and he wonders about certain things in the image, and he looks at it, he looks at it again, he looks at it again, because there's a story embedded in that particular image. And I don't have any great rules of thumb for that secret sauce, in terms of what creates that perfect image where the viewer just wants to keep coming back to it. But it usually involves some mood, some emotion, some story in the image that intrigues the viewer.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Now where
pleasure.
can our audience find you?
Well, I post most every day on Instagram at David Long 3653, or they can see my images, my ebooks, or blogs. I do quite a few blogs out there on davelongphoto.com.
davelongphoto.com.
Yeah, pretty easy.
And then the Instagram handle is what again?
David Long 3653.
Well, thank you so much for being on the Understand Photography Show, David.
Always a pleasure, Peggy. Very good to talk to you.
Again, I should say. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us on the Understand Photography Show. Remember that we'll have some of David's pictures. Maybe he can show us some of these amazing landscape photos. They'll be on our in the show notes on our website at understandphotography.com. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peggy Farron. See you next week.
Thanks very much, Peggy.